Okay, there we go. I heard the Zoom voice.
That's really fun.
All right, so I'm going to get started on my oral thesis presentation. Thank you, everybody, for just being flexible, for kind of bearing with me with the bad news, pun intended, on Monday, where I kind of came down with a stomach virus, which I thought was COVID, and then found out was food poisoning. So yeah, it's just kind of going with the flow here. It's been the whole story of this semester, I would say. But yeah, without further ado, this is the oral presentation of my thesis, The Nuisance of News, examining why all news seems bad. My name is Benjamin S. Randall. I'm a journalism and media communication student that will be graduating in about 7 days. And the thesis committee is here on this call, Joe Champ and Michelle Ansell, and the thesis chair is Dr. Katie Abrams. And this was created in tandem with the Colorado State University Honors Program. So I'm going to start my presentation the same way that I actually start the thesis dissertation, which is with kind of a foreword on what happened at the beginning of this semester. It's a foreword on bad news. I have the date here and kind of the exact time when it happened. But more or less, I take the readers and everybody going through the thesis kind of on what happened on that day of when I was riding my bike down the Poudre Canyon, going really fast, really just kind of enjoying the moment. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, just ate it and fell out of the aerodynamic position I was in, and immediately felt my injuries, felt kind of the world begin to turn black. And yeah, it was quite a moment of bad news for me. I say this in part to emphasize that, for one, it definitely instilled a sense of uncertainty on my last semester here at CSU, especially in regard to structuring kind of my process for this thesis. I had originally intended to do a lot of sampling and a lot of kind of community engagement and involvement, but this had to change slightly with kind of how my mobility was at the beginning of the semester in late August, September, and early October, when I wasn't able to move around as freely. So I kind of had to adjust my thesis on the fly to fit more of kind of a research-based model. But the other reason I emphasize this is to kind of paint the picture of the subjectivity of news. In the events that followed after this crash, I was thankfully found by the Poudre Valley ER team, and I was taken for immediate care and surgery, and recovery ensued, physical therapy. I was on a liquid diet for a little bit. There was many other life-changing parts, but life went on. The world might have turned dark for me for a little bit, but for a lot of other people, whether you knew me or you didn't know me, life continued to go on. To some people, the news of my crash might have been very, very saddening. It might have been gut-wrenching. And to others, it might have been perceived as no news at all. And this is really kind of how I get into this main topic that I hit on in my thesis, which I'm calling the subjectivity news dilemma. I've kind of broken this aforementioned incident down into 3 segments here. You have my point of view, and then the for Ben point of view, and then the anti-Ben point of view. And this can justly be kind of portrayed with any category of news, whether you're looking at entertainment, political, kind of shock, culture value. But from my point of view, I broke my arm, I fractured my jaw, I did all of these things. I had the onset of physical therapy, way less free time for school. It was an abundance of bad news for me. But for people that were, say, enemies of me, or they were opposing athletes, or just someone who generally didn't want the best for me, this whole incident could actually be perceived as somewhat of neutral, if not good news. It could mean that an athlete that they were kind of scared of competing against is now out of competition. It could mean that they have a chance for glory. Sometimes it's just a simple, people like to see people fail type of thing. And again, I'm emphasizing this because news is highly, highly subjective, and we're all allowed our own opinions on what makes news good or what makes news bad. And this is really the dilemma that I'm exploring in this thesis, because you always hear kind of the mention of all the reporters ever show on the news channel is the bad stuff, or I hate watching the news because it always makes me sad. There's no good news. This is a very, very opinionative and subjective claim that I'm really kind of interested in exploring. And that's the purpose of this thesis project. So in order to kind of establish this foundation for what is making news good or bad, or what people perceive as this, there needs to be some sorts of foundations in place. So I'm addressing this issue of subjectivity, where I'm saying that everyone is, again, entitled to their own beliefs, their opinions, and so forth, and that people can kind of consider what they want. A good aspect of life can change spontaneously. So, for example, one person could side with a certain political party, and because of the actions of a member of that political party, they could justly, spontaneously change their opinion to another, thus making good news automatically bad news. It is an extreme issue, and it would make analyzing this whole paper very, very difficult and putting kind of like writing to the foundations of this paper. So for the purpose of the thesis, I needed to establish a good and bad analysis from a very general point of view. So general meaning negating the opinions and personal preferences of the individual, and viewing all of the media sphere as a component of our life that communicates generally good and generally bad events. And just kind of a forward here, moving on at this point in the presentation and in the thesis, good news and bad news is kind of quantified as G and B values, just for the sake of consistency. And honestly, it just flows better in the paper, other than writing good and bad out, because it started to seem a little monotonous. But this established the foundation for what I'm calling the general news perception, which is essentially an understanding that positive values, all numbers above zero, thus indicate a positive or a good news perception, and understanding that negative values, all numbers below zero, are going to indicate a bad news perception. And the way this could play out is the general news perception is equal to good perception of news minus the bad perception of news. So say that 100 individuals were tasked to read an article, and they were all polled afterwards on if their comprehension of the article was either good or bad. Say it was a certain politician elected into office. Say that 55 of the polled participants indicated the article is good, and the remaining 45 said that the article was bad. Thus, the general news perception would be -5, which would indicate a bad value, and that the general societal news perception of that article was good. And that's kind of the way that that can be applied for the purposes of this paper. And that's something that's going to be explored more in the second segment of my thesis. There are some big differences between good and bad news. And one thing I was mainly interested in is how does the news perception and the way that we understand, say, weather events, catastrophes, sports events, entertainment value, how does this news perception impact the actual foundations of society? And I found a very interesting study from Davey 2020, where this quote was mentioned. I'm not going to read this all in its entirety, but basically it's going on to say from a psychological standpoint that it's not very surprising that there's growing evidence that the more bad news that we consume, the more our mental health is kind of taking a downfall. It's affecting our mental health, and it's increasing anxiety, depression, acute stress reactions, and notably it's changed quite a bit the whole paradigm of how much bad news is in our kind of media sphere within the last 10 to 20 years. So justly, bad news is, well, it's bad for us. It is something that doesn't really do a lot of good things for society. And it's explored in my thesis paper, indicating that societal function isn't at its best point when everybody is consuming bad news. So this would mean that, say, people aren't as motivated in the workplace. People aren't motivated to get up early and to exercise and to do their work and to take action in their families. So in general, the more that we consume bad news, the more that an overarching job and then workplace, then organization, and scaled up all the way to a society can falter. So this is quite an issue of bad news in the sense of the more that we consume, the more that it's really kind of degrading our society. And I had this quote from J.P. Harrell from about 20 years ago, where participants were instructed to watch kind of concentrations of good value news, positive news in the media, and they were found to have decreased levels of stress and anxiety. So justly, good news does quite the polar opposite of this. Additionally, people were instructed to watch a short amount of bad news, and they were found to have a 27% higher likelihood of being more depressed for the remainder of the day. So justly, bad news and good news has a very, very notable effect on our mental states, on our clarity, and on our overall kind of societal function in life. The next point of my thesis is really the part that I'm extremely interested in, and it begins to delve into news and our perception of bad news from a psychological level, and analyzing this kind of psychological perception across time and space. So I'm exploring this notion called the negativity bias that we actually explored in Dr. Katie Abrams' food and natural resources class, where food and natural resources communication class, that is, where we kind of explore different types of media biases and how that affects not just an individual, but a public's perception of news and media overall. So the negativity bias is basically a tactic used by media all across the world, as well as a ideology held by humanity, but it's used by media all around the world to leverage viewers to click on articles, to view different videos, and to listen into podcasts that will wildly increase profits. And this is done through clickbait headlines. It's done through sensationalism, yellow journalism, and through spin journalism. But this isn't solely an issue of the media favoring bad news. It's unfortunately kind of a bigger issue of the human affinity for evil. We kind of love the dark and the doom and the gloom and ever so entertaining threats to our existence. And as scary as that sounds, it makes sense. We're human nature, and the way that we've evolved is we identify threats as they come. It's a fight or flight type of response, where when something comes up and it might pose a threat to, say, job security, or how much food we have at home, or something that will directly impact us and our kind of understanding of the world, that is going to attract our attention most. And primarily, that is bad news. That's how the negativity bias is dominating our news cycle, and how it's kind of a continuous sort of chain of events that I'm pretty sure will never be able to be kind of unwarped. The media sphere may be stuck into primarily portraying bad news and portraying news that has that kind of shock and horror value. because it's our intrinsic nature to seek out those threats and eliminate them. While this topic is going to be discussed more in depth in the next section of this thesis, the tendency to pay more attention to bad news than good news, it really just boils down to that evolutionary process where news is quite literally a matter of life or death to many of us. I found this pretty funny, more or less, when looking into more of the psychological element of the negativity bias. And it's a great point, quite honestly. Like, if we wanted to communicate only good news, and there are several news chains out there. I remember during the course of the pandemic, I think it was the actor who played Jim Halpert on The Office, and a couple other kind of famous like comedians and actors and actresses. They came together and they made this like good news channel because everybody was focused on the pandemic and it was all doom and gloom and people were just tired of bad news. But it is kind of easy to see why good news or neutral value news begins to get old and it's not very profitable. So I include this quote here where I say that media editors find it very hard to create clickable headlines from the fact that, say, John Doe is fine and dandy for the 3,578th consecutive day and nothing is new. That's not news. That's just the norm. So when you have something like this, as opposed to that headline that I have attached to the top of the slide where it says, "Did aliens take Elvis?" which is quite clearly a sensational, attention-grabbing headline. It's very hard to not portray the news as something that is oftentimes failure or disaster or entertainment value, kind of bloody types of news. So now I'm getting into one of the most interesting studies that I go over in my thesis, which is still kind of within the segment of analyzing news from across time and space. But I found a study in 1984 with Jack Haskins, Mark Miller, as well as Jan Quarles. They're all either students or professors at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And they were exploring a very similar notion and created this thing called a news direction scale. It's entailing a 7-point scale found highly reliable by intercoder and intercoder tests with 18 coders. But more or less what this means is they kind of made this sort of spectrum that I have laid out here on the slide, where on one far end of the spectrum, there's extremely bad news. And then you have the mean, which is some sort of kind of this prior slide here of that neutral value news, and then extremely good news. And I've linked two pictures here on the slide where you have economic uprise and great news on the far right. And then on the left, you have a war headline. So this same concept of rating the news and kind of applying it to a scale, just as Haskins and his team did in 1984 to a small town in Knoxville, the same kind of tactic is something that I wanted to try out on my own. So thus, I was exploring different types of news sites and thought that the New York Times would be a fairly bipartisan, simple news source that has everything documented on the web to kind of explore this topic. So very interestingly, the New York Times actually has a site map accessible to everybody on their website, where it goes as far back as to the creation of the paper in the 1800s, where you can view every single article ever published. And while that might only be fascinating to a journalism major, I thought it was very interesting and thought it was very useful for this study. So I have 3 different newspaper clippings here, and this is something explored far deeper in my thesis, but this is where I begin to apply that general news perception equation that we're talking about, the good perception subtract bad perception, where you get kind of an idea of how the public is viewing this. And so the purposes of this was to see how the news has been perceived, not just over time, but over time and space, from 1900, November 1st, 1950, November 1st, and 2000, November 1st. The dates all kept the same for continuity, and the New York Times, being the news entity, kept the same as well for consistency and continuity. So what I did was I went through every article on those days, and I documented how many of them fit the equation in terms of good and bad. In 1900, I found that there were 128 bad perceived and 22 good, equaling a negative perception of news. In 1950, I found there were 321 bad and 48 good, again, equaling a negative perception of news. And as you can see, as we increase with time, thus do the articles. It's something I explore more in my paper, where we're really seeing an increase in the amount of articles published. And perhaps most interestingly, as a side note, I found that the Washington Post publishes an average of 1,200 stories, graphics, and videos per day. So that's an incredible amount of journalism published every single day. And thus, this has been increasing as time has gone on. And in 2000, there are 404 bad and 65 good, again indicating a negative perception of news. So what does this mean? It can be inferred that as news has evolved across time and space, judging from the newspaper headlines from a very reliable, largely bipartisan news source, the New York Times, that the news has and probably always will be leaning towards that bad side of news values. This is due to that negativity bias that I was discussing earlier, bred through our evolutionary process of fight or flight and to survive at all costs. And while sad, this is something that I want to emphasize as a paradigm shift, or at least a recommendation for readers and viewers of news, that while all news might seem that it's bad, all news truly isn't bad. As I'm laying out on the slide, there are 128 bad, 22 good in 1900. You get the picture. Like, as there are bad news, there are also good elements of news. It's a matter of muting the news, or a matter of kind of seeking out those heartwarming stories, those stories of the kitten that was saved from the tree, or the man who got elected after running for office for the 5th time in his hometown. You just kind of have to search a little bit and be open to some criticism and some swaying in your news values, and seeking out different sides of both conservative, liberal, and whatnot spectrums that are portraying news. The final segment of my paper explores news at probably the most deepest level, being how it psychologically affects us. And I start this whole segment off with that ever so outdated notion that we're taught in our journalism classes of, if it bleeds, it leads. It's a problematic one. It's dehumanizing, and I would err to say that it's morally wrong to teach this, but it's not incorrect. I include this quote from I'm trying to remember the university that she was at. She was at Pepperdine University. Her name is Sarah Best. She's a journalist that wrote this opinion editorial this year, where she says, "Are people being subconsciously desensitized to death, violence, and pain with constant exposure to the worst parts of humanity?" The issues of this phrase, and this phrase is, "if it bleeds, it leads," that she's implying. The issues of this phrase implies that the most shocking and horrendous events get the most attention in the scope of news. If it bleeds, it leads must be left out of newsrooms and replaced with a greater emphasis of exercising more compassion and empathy. I think Sarah's correct. You flash forward 131 years, and this notion of fear-induced media, from the kind of conception of "if it bleeds, it leads" in the 1880s by William Randolph Hearst. You flash forward 131 years, and this is still kind of the bestseller in terms of journalism. The shock horror value of news is quite still the thing that is at the forefront of everyone's minds, which again is another thing that boils down to that negativity bias. I conducted a survey to kind of see how individuals are viewing the news and if it affects their overall kind of want or desire to view news. This is something that I did on LinkedIn. Overall, 293 individuals viewed, with 14 respective individuals voting, which says something else about news interaction, but that's not for the purpose of this paper. But these were the following results. 10% indicated, or 2 votes for 10%, indicating that 10% of the news they watch is bad, 0 votes for 25, 6 for 50, 4 for 75%, and 2 votes for 90%. In summary of the small sample size of 14 voters, about 86% or 6/7 indicated that the news was generally bad in nature, voting that 50% or higher of the media content they viewed was bad. I'm not sure if this is an accurate reflection that the media just isn't portraying what we want to see, but doing so because it's more beneficial to their overall profits. It may be, and it's this fiscally motivated media bias has a large impact on our overall perception of news on an individual and a societal level, which has startling rippling effects, as I discussed at the forefront of this thesis, within our civilization, being that nearly all news is biased in one way or another, even the most bipartisan sources, such as the New York Times or Reuters or the Associated Press. And this means that most news consumers are therefore affected by media bias. This can go as far to influence voters, to influence election outcomes, and it can cause the polarization of public opinion, which complicates agreements on very contentious topics and things that are discussed in our modern news sphere. But as I mentioned previously, bad news doesn't mean muting media is acceptable. As we've kind of progressed through the 21st century, there seems to be this paradigm of the more bad news we consume, the more we're apt to not even care about the news at all. It's the overarching problem that I'm taking away from my whole research for this thesis. And I think this is best emphasized by this quote here from Hamburg, saying that Fox News viewers were most misinformed about the Iraq war. And over 40% of viewers believed that weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, which is the reason used by the US government to justify war. So this goes directly back to what I was just talking about, how this can influence not only election outcomes, but influence the polarization of public opinion, which can complicate a contentious topic such as going into war. This is a huge problem and something that will definitely need to be explored more, and that I have in my recommendations at the end of my thesis for exploring more of kind of that psychological effect on how news impacts us on individual and societal levels. My main takeaway is that we need to be selective about the news that we consume, as well as we need to seek out those feel-good stories, that kitten in the tree story that I was talking about earlier, because they're instrumental to not only the future of humanity's relationship with journalism, but it could help us build foundations for breaking down that negativity bias that we've evolved with. It could go as far as to help us start building the foundations for creating a new paradigm of news, from not being interested by the bad, by the threats, by going into war, guns and blood, but instead being influenced and seeking out good news. This is kind of the final takeaway of my paper, and something that I'm hoping can be a paradigm shifter for years to come. I've really enjoyed this whole research and thesis project. It's been more work than I think I've ever taken on before. It's definitely more than any other college essays I've wrote, I'll tell you that. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it, just analyzing it from a journalism and a psychological, and just being a curious individual. It's been fascinating. And at this point, I just would like to try to answer some questions about why all news seems bad, about what you all think of my thesis presentation.
Okay.
I can.
Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, like excellent work. That was really informative and engaging. So well done with that. One question I had was, given what you presented there, how do you balance like what our society needs to know in terms what is you know the quote unquote the bad things we need to know with consuming too much bad news? And certainly I think what we're going through now with the pandemic, I mean, it is certainly bad and perceived to be bad, but also we need to know it. Climate change, poor lending practices, again, all bad things.